actually brought to me, and unfortunately that was Kiri from Watson and IBM. He's a VP, and he spent 6 hours at the airport yesterday trying to get out and here, and unfortunately his flight eventually got canceled. And so I'm very grateful to Brigham Hyde, who's the Chief Data Officer and Head of Analytics at DRG, another one of our sponsors. It's a big life science data and analytics firm who agreed to pitch in. He actually has a tremendous background and is perfectly qualified to deliver this talk about how big data is actually being used today in the world of healthcare. He's research faculty at the MIT Media Lab in the Department of Connection Science. He works a lot on applications of AI in healthcare. He has a 10-year history working in the medtech industry. He's already asked some very insightful questions, if you heard him before, and works very closely with biopharma, diagnostic, and important hospitals in improving value-based care. So he brings that whole set of experiences and knowledge base to us, and he's going to give us an insight in how this big data is actually being used today, and effectively so, to drive care. Did I get that about right? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming, and also thank them as well for supporting this conference. Thank you very much.
Thanks everybody. Is the mic on? You guys hear me okay? Great. So this talk has 3 significant challenges that were presented to me. Number 1, I have to follow the guy in a kilt and the awesome companies he presented was something interesting. So that's number 1. Number 2, you were all expecting the Watson guy, Dr. Rhee, and I am not that guy. Frankly, that's half the reason I came. But I will try and overcome that, as well as the fact that I'm the only thing between you and lunch. So I've developed a strategy of how I'm going to address this. Number 1, I'm going to be quick. Number 2, I'm going to talk about my 3-year journey to develop my art installation for the Playa, which is unifying the U.S. data system. And I'll talk about how far we've come with that. And lastly, I will steal some IBM slides very blatantly and point at them. So I will be quick. Thank you guys for your attention, and we'll get you to lunch. So yes, quick note about DRG. I'm not sure people know who we are. There are logos on the bottom right that you might know. We have purchased many different companies. For my medtech colleagues, you'll know us as Millennium Research Group. We have one of the standard data sets for device purchasing and utilization. So for the doctors in the room, I'm the one who helps them profile you and decide who to call. For people who are on the provider side, Health Business Insights, it's a company we acquired pretty recently, but it's been awesome for me because it's gotten me into the clinic, in with the IDNs, working on these cost and quality questions and using data. Really exciting there. And several others here that sort of bridge across sort of data and analytics broadly in healthcare. DRG's over 1,000 people worldwide. More than half of those people are MDs, PhDs, or masters in the relevant analytic topics. I lead the analytics team there, and as Chief Data Officer, I've led our data licensing strategy, so I've lifted up all the rocks. I know where it is, good or bad, in the US and also now in Europe. And we get to actively work with everybody in the room here. So I'm going to bring that experience to this discussion. I also accomplished a lifelong goal of becoming research faculty at the MIT Media Lab. This is my happy place. If anybody's worked with these people, they're great. They're the reason I know Stefano. Come and collaborate with us. We're doing awesome things. People in this room might know it for the material science side, what they've done with limb replacement, things like that. There's a lot of really interesting things going on. Please check it out. Okay, and this is my blatant IBM steal. So this is actually their slide. And this is one that I think is really important to level set on when we talk about big data. And these are the 4 V's of big data. What makes it actually big? And I think it's important to understand when we're talking about big data in Silicon Valley, that's very different than big data in healthcare, and recognize the implications of that. If you think about volume of data, the sheer size of the data, the number of rows, the zettabytes, if you will, healthcare is an afterthought. It is a joke compared to what comes out of cell phones, social media, retail transactions, and the rest. And it's important to remember that because when we're talking about the skills and approaches we need to use, a lot of the ones that have been developed are developed to deal with the volume and to some extent the velocity problems of those other big data worlds. We're just not ready in healthcare. We don't have the substrate, and it's important to remember that. I find myself dealing much more on the left-hand side of this slide, which is around variety and veracity. And those last 7 talks, I mean, some great approaches to how to deal with that. Lots of work to be done. Every conference like this ends up in a reductive discussion around interoperability. I refuse to let that be our excuse. And I think if I have a message, it would be for all of you to not let that hinder what we can accomplish. But to be real, the variety and veracity meaning difficulty of the types of data fields, the materials in it, the complexity of the language, we have a huge variety and veracity problem. So when we talk about data science, we talk about analytics, a lot of the developments, they need to come on that side and already are to some extent. This is another thing I want to sort of level set on. So this is one of those eye chart slides deliberately, but why are we talking about AI? If last year, somebody mentioned last year was the big data year, this is the AI year. Let me just give my impression of why we're talking about AI. And it's because the infrastructure has really been built outside of healthcare to now begin to deploy AI. I highlight Apache Spark. That has absolutely changed my team's life. People don't know it. Open source that really enables you to leverage a lot of the research that's been done in AI and machine learning in a way that's much more scalable. But the rest of the industries are now beginning to accelerate in AI because they're able to leverage this infrastructure. I'll point out that that doesn't totally apply to healthcare because of the problem we talked about, which is that we don't have the volume, the velocity necessarily, and we also have broken up or disparate data. So all week, for those of you here this week, when you're hearing about AI healthcare, trying to remember why we're talking about it and how it might not quite be full steam in healthcare yet. I'll come back to maybe disproving that. This is a fun slide, which is also an eye chart, but this is my sort of best rendering of the algorithms being used in AI. And I'm about to completely bastardize this for people who are AI experts in any one of these fields, so be gentle with me. But one way to think about this, when I think about healthcare, is which of these are actually relevant to healthcare? And I can share this slide for people who want pictures of it. It's a fun one. So down on the bottom left, there's regression. Okay. Hey, that's old school. MDs can do that, right? That's actually machine learning. Okay, cool. So that we see a lot in clinical, right? So that's actually being used. I don't know whether we'd actually call it AI, but that's there. Bayesian, up in the top right, that's been around a while. I've seen that used in healthcare quite a bit. And actually, it's pretty good at prediction for a lot of things we do. I like this one. I think we can say we're using that. Decision tree, well, okay. I mean, it's more academic. It's not something you would use as much in the real world. I won't get into why, but there are more powerful options out there. Down here in the bottom, if I look at sort of instance-based or some of the other hierarchical clustering, great for discovery, meaning let's find the factors or things that are interesting, but not exactly real time. So, again, people are using that, but again, I wouldn't call that sort of in play on a daily basis for healthcare. Dimensionality is exciting, but tough to find good talent. I mean, everybody's fighting. I'm fighting for this talent, but it's not out there with as many heads as some of the other areas. If I go to deep learning, could be really great for healthcare. But again, our data problem, both not being big enough and being disparate, really shoots holes in this. The deep learning stuff, you drive down back to SFO and you look at the billboards, that's what everybody's building out here, but they're not really building it for healthcare yet. Important to recognize where these things are because of the data they're dealing with. And then sort of this big group here, which is sort of some of the more innovative areas. If you have one of those types of approaches or algorithms on your resume, walk outside, you can get a job, right? I mean, this is for financial industry, for oil and gas, for retail. This is where a lot of the innovation in sort of that true AI is coming from. In healthcare, this isn't where the playing field is right now, at least from where I sit. Not that there can't be innovation, but we're being held back by the data size. Okay, this is the one slide that I'm going to sit on for a minute. And this is the one, when I teach this at MIT, that all the students in the room all pick up their pencils. So I take that as a signal that this is actually pretty interesting. I want to lay out what's on here. So back to my installation and my journey to build my Ply installation. About 3 years ago, having sold my first startup and having some resources and travel dollars to spend at my new acquirer, I sort of said, well, if everybody complains about interoperability and that you can't get data together, and everybody on the analysis side says, well, I can't figure this out because I don't have connected data, like, what if we just said, no, I'm not going to worry about that. I'm going to solve it. I'm going to go get it. The first question I asked was, where the heck can I get the data from? And this map tries to articulate the thinking on that. I'm just going to walk you guys around the circle here and then talk about some implications. So if you're a device company, let's just start up there, and let's say I'm Medtronic. Given that J&J was lead sponsor, I probably should have changed that graphic. But let's say I'm Medtronic. I know what I sold, right? I know where my devices went, and I have that information, but I don't have any information about other devices. I don't really know anything about where they were put in. I don't know how they were tracked. I don't know other stuff that happened to patients, but I know that. So probably not good enough just to go to them. What if I went to a wholesaler like MedAssets? MedAssets will bundle and resell and deliver and sort of do logistics for many of these device companies, also drug companies. What if I went to them and said, well, do they have all of it? And you would go to them and you'd say, okay, well, yeah, maybe they know the price. Maybe they know, like, who's buying what at what price, meaning what provider-side institutions, but they don't still know much about how it's being utilized. So we got to keep going. Okay, well, what if I got to Brigham Women's? And let's say any hospital or IDN or outpatient facility. Well, they have their own data. You guys, provider side, you have your data, whether that's claims or EMR or any variation of that, purchasing, right? But you only have your stuff, right? So you don't have the hospital down the street. You don't know what happened to the patient after he left your facility. And if I was going to try and buy all the U.S. data from the health systems, I'd have to go around and herd the cats. I mean, we're talking about 270,000 outpatient facilities, 7,000 hospitals, 5,000 IDNs. That sounds like a nightmare. I don't want to do that. And frankly, you guys are tough to deal with because you don't know how to sell data. So I don't want to do that. But in theory, somebody has that. By the way, you could also put pharmacies on here. I'm doing the MedTech version of these, but just so everybody's aware. The next one you find, and I'll go to EHR first. So we know that there are, give or take, 100 players in the EHR market, and market share-wise, there's really 5. Okay, so hey, great. Let's just go to them. They have it all, right? Turns out that they don't have claims side information, really. So I can't tell what was paid for. I can't tell what payers did. Okay, I often can't tell, even within an institution, how that might have transferred. Also, there's big interoperability problems, as we all talked about. And they have differing views, I would say, on whether or not they're able and willing to resell that data. Those of you on the provider side might be shocked about whether or not you believe that you've signed away rights to sell that data. I will tell you that you have or will, so I'll come back to that. But for instance, Epic believes that I'm Epic, I have #1 market share, and they're not particularly willing to sell their data or unify it with anybody else, because the minute they do, their data becomes less individually valuable. So I back away from that one. Then we go to the switch. Who's ever heard of Emdion? Here are a couple hands. Who's ever heard of Change Healthcare? Who's ever heard of Relay Health? Okay, let me just explain what the switch is. Another word for it is clearinghouse. But essentially, it's a group of companies that grew up because if I was a provider and I wanted to get paid, I had to figure out where to send my bill, right? My set of codes. My UB04, right? And even if I was a big institution really on top of that, it's really hard for me to keep track of what payers are where, and does this plan line up to this thing, and well, did they move addresses? And if we go back in time, this is all by mail. And so what formed was these series of companies called switches or clearinghouses, Emdion being one, that basically route claims from the provider side to the payer side and back, okay? The net effect of all of this is that there are few of those. There are not that many, #1. #2, they have knowledge of both payer side and provider side dynamics, and they have full transparency into 835, 837 claims. That makes them an extremely good point to go if you want to get everything, right? They don't have the scruples and the challenges that some of the others have. They also, in a amazing twist of fate, obtained exceptional data rights down to the patient identified level from all of their provider side customers. And this is something that's been evolving in the last 10 years. It's not talked about. It's not widely publicized. It is, in my mind, incredibly important to us accomplishing any of the goals we talk about. Because until you have a patient longitudinal data set that includes information beyond your institution, you really can't apply any of the AI we've been talking about. Right? So that's my belief. I'm maybe a little extreme on that. But I view that unification as the #1 factor that leads to cost reduction and better outcomes. Again, I'm in one camp, but I believe that. To round this out, you can also collect information from the payers. Inovalon is a company that's public now that acquires data from payer side, unifies it, and sells this information back to providers, payers, manufacturers, et cetera. I will point out CMS is one of those. Somebody mentioned CMS earlier. I think they're doing some interesting things. If people aren't aware of the Qualified Entity Program, the QECP, they are now releasing patient-level data to very heavily qualified, I went through the paperwork process, entities, which can and will, I think, open up the potential to really making a difference in that patient population. The problem I have with the payers is the payers do not want anybody to know how they pay for stuff, least of all providers, but also not really manufacturers. So they are going to obfuscate in their data both their identity and the payment terms going back and forth for different things, which people know who on the provider side, that is a constant battle around code bundling, code payment. They are a tricky place to collect from, but you could, okay? Last one on there is employers. I have John Deere up there. Karam, I think, talked about the employer market. I think this is a really interesting area. It's a little big brothery, I'll point out, the idea that your employer could resell your health information. But if I go on sort of this circle, and I've taken you around sort of counterclockwise, the employers have the most leverage because the employer is the one paying the bill, okay? So at some point, if they decide, I want to save money in healthcare, they're actually the ones until, by the way, consumers get more leverage by paying more out of pocket. They're the ones who can actually say, fix this. And they, to date, have really not said that, I'll point out. So at some point, they may become an interesting data source, but for now, they're not really the best. So again, I'll stop with sort of this discussion. I think this is a really interesting area because I don't think people know this. Whether you're provider side, manufacturer side, or otherwise, this is critical because until we unify things, you cannot, in any sense, apply some of the awesome AI and some of the awesome techniques. And if we think that we're going to do it within our institution or by linking a few new systems or creating a few new silos, we're not. It is my belief that this, unifying this in some way is a huge part of it. Just if you're curious how close I am to my Apply installation, I've got 70% of US lives now and 70% of medical events. To the J&J guys, you already buy it. But in short, this has been an interesting sort of experience, and I wanted to share that because I think there's so many smart people in this room and others that could do amazing things if we got to this point. The last thing I'll say, and I'll leave sort of with this, and take an orthopedic spin on this, I agree that, you know, that old world of claims in EHR is really not even what's going to be interesting. I had dinner with one of the leads at Motorola Health, and we had this sort of thought experiment. We said, okay, well, how many genes are there in the human body? It's like, okay, you know, let's call it 28,000 unique genes. All right, and then how many variants of those genes? Let's say that works out to, let's argue it's 100 million, right? Different combinations. If you think about all those data points and variation that lead to health and disease for patients, the number of data points they receive off a cell phone in a single day that could be interpreted as healthcare dwarfs that entire number. So if you talk about big data and you go back to volume and velocity, the potential of this patient digital asset is going to be very real. You know, we've talked about things that Facebook has done, a behavioral that they've read off of sort of our own messages. There's a million other things that are coming on this. There are hundreds of startups that are tracking and computing. And all of those things, by the way, have got to be joined back to that data set we just talked about, but this is coming. For my orthopedics colleagues, you know, I just looked it up. There's 2.3 million people walking around with a hip implant and 4.7 million walking around with a knee implant. Now, if you went to any of these, you went to Fitbit, Basis, any of these startups, and you said you want an install base of 6 million who are actively walking around with a device inside their body, which is blood exposed and exposed to bone, they would jump at that. And I think orthopedics in general, I know the manufacturers in the room are thinking this way, need to start thinking about their practice and their devices as actually digital assets. Whether it's, here's an example, reading the microenvironment of the bone marrow from the end of a hip implant, or monitoring certain blood attributes, or even just signaling three-dimensional movement through multiple points of contact within different devices, using that geometry to judge your patients. These are all possible. And by the way, I think if I were to give the vision to the orthopedics community, if we think about where everything's going here, you want to talk about patient service, you want to talk about your future as a digital employee or as somebody who brings value or can get paid more for your services, providing things like this is going to be huge. And I actually think, because that install base, orthopedics is potentially one of the most interesting. Skip to the end because Stefano is looking at me like lunch is served. I'll just end with this. This is Wayne Gretzky. This is one of my heroes growing up, talking superheroes. And one of the things I said about Wayne Gretzky was he always skated to where the puck was going, not where the puck was. So I'm going to offer my 2 cents on where it's going. You'll hear a lot of opinions this week. I think you have to, everyone in this room has to act right now like all that digital data and all that clinical EHR and claims data is available as one unified set. Now, whether it's because Redox does it, right, or it's because other people get it together to paste that together, or regulation shifts, or whatever it is, you have to develop and design and deploy what you're going to do with that in mind, because I truly believe we are close, and there are multiple reasons why that's happened. But if you allow your mind to think that way, the potential of what you could do not only in orthopedics, but also in your practice, and frankly, the types of innovative companies that could come to fore, I think could really be amazing. And we could actually become like these retail and consumer angles. So I'll stop there. Thanks for your time.
So stay for a few minutes. I think it's, I hope it certainly jogged a lot of thinking on my part. And we'll definitely take a couple of questions, but 3 themes that came to me was one, first of all, which I hadn't really considered as well, is that some of the big data tools that have been so successful outside of healthcare may not have enough data points to be successful in this world of healthcare.
Yeah, the end problem.
The end problem, and the fact that the end wasn't a pretty well defined end, we understood, but the end number itself, we look at our charts and we think that that's a lot of data. And so clearly you level set on that. However, you also came back and said that actually possibly you might disprove that comment, but you didn't really. So what I want to ask you is, where do you see the light down the tunnel?
Yeah, I mean, just talking about my own experience trying to collate this stuff, I'm still not there. I have patient level but de-identified data. I can track 350 million lives longitudinally 5 years. And even with that, there are rare diseases where I don't have enough information because I don't have a complete picture to really answer the question what's going on with that patient. And then you add to that, so if that's my data set, only about 30% of that I have overlapping EHR. It becomes this like Venn diagram of what you actually have collected. And I think for the provider side, some of the smartest people in these great provider institutions like UCSF are trying to do amazing things, but they're doing it with like paper clips and, popsicle sticks in terms of data. Like they're just not, you can't answer all the questions. And I think if I had one wish, it would just be that, we eventually do unify it. And for those of you trying things, know that other people are aggregating data for you and would partner with you, and I would be one of them.
Another point that came to mind was that, and it was a point I was trying to make at the beginning of the last session, was this idea that as we look at what we're integrating and what it's going to do for us, it's not just televisits and it's not just diagnostics remotely. There is so much more that is going to, that the integration of digital health technology is going to do for our ability to interface with the market. And you brought up the idea that we could be collecting data that has value in and of itself, so that we stop just being healthcare providers, and that is the value proposition, that the data we generate through our interface with our clients actually has value. Want to mention?
Yeah, no, and glad you brought that back up. Again, there's a picture of that patient digital asset. I think there's a really interesting conversation about who should own and profit from all that information. Should the patient view themselves as a valuable asset? I think that's an interesting conversation. But in the more near term, if you think about an orthopedics practice, let's say I own a private one, and I could now offer some additional level of tracking, some additional readout. I mean, whether it's sort of consumer-oriented soft science or it's real hard yet, people are responding to that. I mean, people are buying these watches. Like, if you're telling me that in addition you could put a gyroscope in their hip implant, determine if it's affecting their gait the way you want, like, they'll listen, right? I mean, you think about some of the premium care that people pay for. I mean, there's definitely that in. I think orthopedics could lead there.
Yeah, and we're at UCSF doing that. We just got a grant through CDMI, our research group, to, and some of our residents are here. We're going to actually instrument patients, get as much data from them as possible.
Yeah.
We'll go through an episode of care and see what we can learn and glean from it. We're into lunch by 2 minutes, actually. We're remarkably on time. Are there any questions you want to ask Brigham that you think might have interest to the whole audience? And please, Joe. Go ahead, this microphone.
Sorry. Okay. One kind of elephant in the room from more of an academic research side, there's amazing aggregation of data you've mentioned. What's the validity of that compared to what's happening, Pat, like in terms of actual pathology? Can you validate that?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. We get into this a lot when we get into like quality and outcomes and like whose fault was it, right? Like when you start to go down that path and you look at it only from the coding side, my wife's a physician. And so we'll have these discussions where I'm like, what the hell was that person doing? And her immediate response is, well, you don't know what was going on, and they got this patient transferred from here, and the communication didn't come through. So I'm fully aware that you have to caveat any data with where it came from and what its limitations are. I do think, and I think it was Medex was talking about the ability to actually detect when there may be flaws in the collection methodology. Frankly, I can see that. Like, I can see where there are stuff like there's no way they were coding this right, or there may be some reason or flaw. I think there'll be a whole group of companies and analytics groups that basically focus solely on that. I mean, you could talk about coding in the hospital setting. There's just teams that are working on that manually when that could be solved, academically. So I guess to answer your question more directly, yeah, you should caveat everything you look at with here. But the way to get to it is by understanding your collection source transparently and then understanding what the implications of that would be. But it's an important topic.
You and Nick from Aver. Thanks, Richard.
This is Nick. And I have it's a question, and the question is, and I'll have a statement after the question.
Yeah.
How realistically you think it is that we'll be able to aggregate effectively data? And I'll put this in the context of our society, if you want, that we all decided that we don't want a unique personal identification when it comes to health information. Aggregating data becomes very complex and potentially it at times could be dangerous if we don't do it right. And secondly, who is the holder of this data? And finally, why don't we have a health information technology, a health information economy? Because there's an implicit and intrinsic value in everybody's data, and we never pay for this. We expect that they will give it to us for the benefit of better care. A patient will give it to us for the benefit of better care, or nobody steps on the plane with the intent to crash. Everybody steps with the intent to get there.
Yeah, great question. And in a short talk, I didn't get to sort of give my general HIPAA comments, but let me just say a couple things. First, what is new is that there is a model that has emerged that I think can work within HIPAA guidelines. Not only think, I've consulted many legal opinions to make sure I'm right about that, which is that if you have a third party that can de-identify patients, apply statistical DID, and then send back linked codes across sets so that the people who know the identity and the people doing the analysis of the coded identities are separate and, everything's watched closely there. That can work, right? I mean, that works. Frankly, at MIT with Dr. Sandy Pentland, we're working on applying blockchain technology to this. I mean, frankly, we would love to open up the app group to being able to access this aggregate data, right, and actually be able to power behind it. So I'm in the camp of there are methods. Higher level, I think that we are at, and this is completely my read, so maybe way off, and people may disagree. I think because of Edward Snowden, I think because of where we are in the information age, I think people are used to and expect the information to be tracked. And I think that anybody who uses any healthcare app that's on the market right now and doesn't think that that data is being stored somewhere, I don't think people lack that perception. I think what they want is they want value back, because if you think about Google and our search behavior, I think people are generally okay with the idea that Google is storing all that information about us, and then maybe the NSA is even reading it, as long as I get good restaurant recommendations, right? I mean, on some level, that's the bargain that is going on right now. Now, let me offer one other point on this. I also work in Europe. Europe is very different. If you think we're strict on healthcare data, they are at another plane. Do I think that's good or not? You can talk to people in Europe about how it's hindered potentially their own healthcare services. They have the advantages, in most cases, of having a central payer, I'll point out, so they sort of overcome it that way. But the Sunshine Act laws over there prevent that aggregation without you saying, I want to be aggregated for this purpose. It's pretty explicit. I've gone in the same way I've gone in the US to try and buy the data over there and trying to figure that out. Where I'm at, and I'll just give you this sort of data point after doing that for 18 months, most countries are okay with it for the purposes I've described if I am also willing to contribute to the greater good. So the way that comes out is that they want me to form government, not-for-profit consortia to feed back the findings we find off of data to the community. And I think in the essence of that is something we should all tie to, and frankly I wish the US would force, which is that this is okay and we as a society can agree to this if it benefits us, right? And I think that should be the bargain we make, in my opinion.
My clock is giving me 0 time. So I want to be respectful of that, and I want to thank Brigham for chipping in, doing what I think is an exceptional talk, and give us a real insight into the power and some of the elements of the data. Obviously, this could go on for a one-week-long discussion just on data. And the last thought I have to leave with you, though, is the clinicians in the room who look at this and go, the data is not accurate, the data is not good enough, there isn't such stuff. We are going to be asked to move away from a causational data analytic model where we expect a clearly defined cause to be associated with a specific outcome to an associative model where we're going to have to start accepting the trends leading to one direction probably are correct within a certain standard of error, and we're going to be asked to move on those decision trees earlier than the actual analytics would show, largely because the time scale changes. We will not have the luxury of randomized controlled trials that go on for 10 years before we know whether or not we should act. Largely because if we do, we'll be out of business. Somebody else will have moved earlier. So that, I think, is something that's another theme out of the sort of the rapidity of the data acquisition that changes the analytics, which then provides the feedback loops, which are going very quickly. So with that, I would love to get a team photo just before lunch outside if we can arrange that. That's a sort of a last-minute thought I had, so let's try it. But thank you very much,
Thank you.
And we'll come back after lunch.